Hi everybody, Chris here from Skeleton Labs. Today's video is actually a progress video update in regards to Floating UI Svelte. If you've not seen Floating UI Svelte or you've not heard of it, this may be your kind of first introduction to it. We did provide another video recently that kind of talked through the introduction and things like that, so definitely go check that if you haven't already. Today's video is just kind of filling you in on what's changed since that last video. And so several kind of exciting things to kind of cover today. The first being that we are now kind of putting out our first public pre-release of Floating UI Svelte. This actually means that you as the end user can come in, install the library, and actually try it out yourself. We've actually done a lot of work in not just the project itself and the features and things like that, but also the documentation to kind of make this process a little bit simpler, a little easier to use. And so if you have not checked it out, definitely come on to the URL here shown at the top of the page. I will link this in the description for the video as well, so if you just need a quick way to get over and check this out, you'll have that. But you may notice right away there's been several visual updates to the documentation. We're kind of calling out that, hey, this is early access. There's going to be bugs, there's going to be issues, and some breaking changes are expected, that kind of thing. But with that said, we do want to get this in your hands so that you can actually try it out and see what you think. So if you're interested in doing so, I'm actually going to walk you through the process for doing that with this video. So let's actually get started. So I'm going to tap the Get Started button here on the home page. This is going to take you to the installation instructions. You will notice right here at the top that we do call out the fact that you will need to build your application using Svelte 5, which is currently in a release candidate status. It's in a pre-release status as well. So it's not quite ready for production. Definitely don't want to use Svelte 5 in production. And you definitely don't want to use Floating UI Svelte in production either. We're still kind of cooking things here and kind of polishing things out. So, just kind of keep that in mind. You can install it, you can try it out, give us feedback, but it's not really intended for production use quite yet. So just bear with us on that, okay? But just to walk you through some updates in the documentation, we've clearly kind of padded out some information here on the getting started pages of some crucial details you might need to know when you're starting a project or trying to use the library. We've updated the examples and the details page for each example here. So we have tooltips and popovers. Modals and context menus are still marked coming soon. We're still working on some features related to that, so just know that. We've also kind of ported a lot of this information over in regards to the API reference into the documentation itself. Previously, this was part of like the README. It was really hard to find. It was really hard to manage. But now we have nice dedicated pages that kind of walk you through each individual feature. So if you want to know how the use floating hook works, or if you want to see the dismiss feature or the arrow feature, those things are documented. You will expect to see this grow and continue to change and evolve over time, but as it stands, there's quite a lot of information already provided on the page. And really, I think the easiest way to kind of show this off and to kind of get you into the process of seeing how this works is let's actually create a new project. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and set up and scaffold kind of a brand new Svelte 5 project. We're going to install Floating UI Svelte, and then we're going to set up a quick, just a quick demo showing you how you might implement a tooltip. It'll be just a one-off. It's not a reusable component or anything like that, but the concepts will be useful, I think, for most folks. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and jump over to my terminal here. I've got a location that I want to install this new application, and I'm just going to bring in and install a new SvelteKit application. So we're recommending SvelteKit. You can use Astro, you can use Vite if you want, or anything else that can really run Svelte. But do make sure that it is running Svelte 5. Again, just want to call that out. So I'm going to run the SvelteKit CLI here, and it's going to prompt me for a couple questions. So do I want an app with some like demo files in it or a library project? No, we want to go with just a bare bones empty project. Next, it's going to ask if do I want to use TypeScript. I'm going to say yes for this project. It's going to also prompt you for a few additional options here of do you want to have linting or prettier or unit tests or anything like that. I'm going to skip those. They're just not relevant to this, but please feel free to choose those if those are useful for your project. The one important bit is, again, make sure you choose this last option here. That's going to enable Svelte 5 to be installed, the preview version, the release candidate version, so that everything that we're going to show today will work. All right, so that's going ahead and create the project for us. I'm going to just cd into it and go ahead and install the dependencies. That should be pretty much ready to go. So let's go ahead and just run a dev server here, and we're going to open up and just make sure our application is working. So we're going to do that. There we go. It is working. That is confirmed. So that is great. And then the next thing we need to do is I'm actually going to do a couple of things here. So first, I'm going to go ahead and open the project in VS Code, just so we have quick access to that. There we go. Yep. And then I'm going to also come in and I'm going to install a couple of other additional things here. One, I'm going to install TypeScript, or excuse me, Tailwind, because it's optional. It's not something you have to use, but just for this demo, I think it's going to be a little bit simpler. So I'm going to go ahead and do just, again, use another like one-line command here using a service called Svelte add. It's a CLI that will install and configure Tailwind in our Svelte application. You're more than welcome to use the default instructions on the Tailwind site if you prefer, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to do this real quick. And again, I'll kind of reiterate, I'm using Tailwind, but it is completely optional if you want to use that in your Floating UI Svelte application or not. If you prefer vanilla CSS or some other CSS option, please go ahead and use that. We're just going to do that today just because, again, I'm faster and it's simpler for me. Okay, and so that is installed. The next thing we need to do is actually go ahead and install Floating UI Svelte. And so I'm going to copy this straight from the documentation. I'm actually using PNPM, so I'm going to grab the second command here. We're going to let that install. Okay, good. There we go. Good to go. And then I will call out a couple details on this getting started page, just so you kind of have a frame of reference of some of the things that I might go over, sort of quickly here. So the first thing to note is that you do not need to install Floating UI, the package itself, directly from the official package from Floating UI. It's called Floating UI DOM, I believe. Yeah, something like that. We basically will package all of that into our library, and so all of that is exposed for you. So if you need to import middleware like Flip or a particular type from Floating UI, all of that is exposed and can be just imported directly from our package. Okay. The next thing is we need to go ahead and set up either a class or some kind of styling that we can use to apply to any of our quote unquote floating elements, the popovers themselves. The reason for this is this just provides some default styling to kind of remove it from the flow of the document so that it actually overlaps the page content and floats. So I'm going to cover that in just a moment and how I'm going to handle that. But we would put a nice recommendation here if you're curious to see what styles are needed. And these come straight from Floating UI. This is their recommendation. We're just following suit. I also mentioned that Floating UI does not take an opinionated stance on Z indexing. So if you want to have different layers, if you want to have pop-ups in front of each other, in the vertical stack, or excuse me, the Z stack, then make sure that you handle that yourself. It's not built into Floating UI, and it's not built into Floating UI Svelte either. There's also one more caveat specifically for release Svelte kit users. If you're using SSR for server-side rendering, there is a way to kind of handle kind of one sort of gotcha that kind of might appear where if you render your tooltip or popover, it might kind of appear on the wrong place on the page, on page load. That is due to SSR, and we provide some instructions on how you can kind of handle that. Shouldn't be relevant for this demo today, but just wanted to call that out in case you do disable, or you have server-side rendering issues that might pop up there. Okay, so let's return to our project. The next thing we need to do is, again, I mentioned we need to import those kind of floating styles that we're going to use throughout the project. So what I've gone ahead and done is just created some example styles just for this demo. So I'm just going to bring these, I'm just going to copy these in from off screen. You can pause the video if you're curious to see what this is doing. Just run through it real quick, setting some body styles, some typography styles for headings. I'm going to create a class for button styles and a class for our popover elements themselves. And then the actual class that we recommend in the documentation, which is the floating class that adds the width size, the positioning, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's check out our new updated server. This should have all of our dependencies installed, should have our styles installed, and there we go. We have some basic styles on the page, but we do not yet have our popover itself. So let's kind of take a look at what we can do for that. So the other thing I'm going to do is go ahead and open the root page. So we're going to go to routes, pages here, and I've copied, again, I've got some styles kind of prepared off screen here that I'm going to bring in. That's just going to kind of provide some boilerplate for our page structure. So we're going to have a script tag where we're going to put some logic. We're going to have a main tag with some basic Tailwind styles. We're going to have a header section, and then we're going to have an empty section that we are going to insert some of our own custom markup for the pop-up itself. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Let's take a look at our page. It's going to look very, very similar to before. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to jump back over to the documentation. We're going to click the tooltips page. And then this is really the area we're going to focus on. So again, please feel free to come to the documentation, read this in detail if you're kind of curious the specifics of how some of this is working. But for now, I'm just going to open the code example here, and you're going to see there's quite a bit of logic, quite a lot of boilerplate here to create a single instance tooltip. But we're going to do this, and then we're going to talk through what's actually happening. So let me just kind of copy some of the important stuff in here. We're going to copy the logic. We're also going to copy the page markup here, and then I'm going to make a couple changes to classes just so they match the classes that I created just a moment ago. Okay, let's save that, and let's go see if that's actually working for us. So we can now hover over our little button that's been added to the page here and see a floating element. Now, obviously, there's a couple issues here. One, it's going off the page, so we'll need to sort that. The other issue, it's a little small, so you may not be able to see it, but the little arrow at the bottom of the tooltip there is kind of off. It's not the right color. So there's a couple of things we'll need to touch up real quick for that. But let's just, before we kind of get into the details, let's just take a look and see what's actually happening on the page, okay? So starting at the top, we're importing the fade transition from SvelteKit itself. That's straight from Svelte. That is used for providing kind of the fade. You're going to see like that subtle like in and out fade as we hover that. That's using just directly a Svelte transition. We're also importing a number of different features directly from Floating UI Svelte. This includes the auto update feature, the offset. There's actually a few here that are related to middleware, as Floating UI calls it. A component that we're using for our feature we're using for a hook for use floating, which is the core configuration hook that we actually use. The component we're using for the floating arrow itself, and then several kind of items related to interactions and dismiss. So again, we're going over this real quick, but we're gonna talk through a little bit more detail here below. Okay. So really the initial part, the most important thing on here is this use floating hook. So when you start using the library, the very first thing you want to do is take a look at how use floating works. So if we come back to the documentation, we have an API reference page for this. It'll kind of give you that nice little description up here saying that this is the most important hook. It is kind of the hook that controls everything, right? It's the central hub. So it's typically set up just like this. You have kind of a reference that you create that uses the hook, and then any kind of options that you want to set at sort of the global level for that particular instance, you would provide that right here in this little object. If you're curious what those options are, you can actually scroll down a little bit, and we have all of that documented down here on the page. So you can see things like handling the open state, the open change state, what's the placement? Is it on the top, bottom, left, right, etc.? What's the strategy that's used for this? If it's absolutely positioned or something else. any middleware that we're going to pass in, which is, think of these as small little modules that add extra functionality. So an extension for a browser, that's kind of the similar concept, right? Little package that adds something to the overall experience there. And then on and on and on. I'll skip through a couple of these because they're not super exciting. The other kind of interesting thing is what is returned. So when we're actually creating that use floating instance, what can we actually do with this? So there's several values that are returned, including the kind of X and Y position, some of the values that we passed in, some of the data returned back from the middleware, and so on and so forth. So several kind of interesting little bits and pieces that we can take advantage of there. So if we look at kind of a very like bare bones example, we need two elements on the page to kind of go coordinate alongside this. We need the reference element, which is typically your button or the input or whatever you're going to have the tooltip kind of anchored to, right, or interact with. So when you hover the button or you click the button or you click the input, that's the thing that's the reference, right? That's the thing that Floating UI is going to kind of monitor. The other portion is obviously the floating element itself. And so per our instructions just a moment ago, we mentioned that you can create pretty much any element you want. Just make sure that you add that floating class. That floating class, again, adds some base styles that are useful for the positioning. In addition to that, we're also binding this particular element so that we can kind of pass a reference into our use floating. And then we're doing, taking some styles that are generated from the computed styles and applying those. And what that's doing is actually handling the position on the page. So if it's supposed to be X position here and Y position here, et cetera, it's going to handle and calculate all of that on the fly. So fun math stuff, right? So let's take a look at kind of how we've implemented. So again, we're using a floating reference to use floating. We've got several options kind of configured in here. And if we come and take a look at our markup, we have a button here. It's got a bound element reference here. We're also spreading some prop information onto the button, some attributes that need to be applied to that. And then just using a class to style the button itself. That's a custom class, again, that I created over in that global style sheet. You can see that right there. The other thing we have is kind of a conditional statement of whether or not the element should be rendered, if it's an open state or not. It's just a div. It's using that floating style we were talking about. We're also applying some custom styles to make it look nice and pretty when it's displayed on the screen. Again, similar to the button, those are custom styles that I've provided. And then we're binding an element reference. We're passing some styles into the element, and then passing some additional props or attributes onto this. You can also see this is where we're using that transition fade. So we're actually applying that. And of course, if you're familiar with Svelte, you know how this kind of stuff works. When the open and close state happens, then the transition for the fade occurs, and then iteration or any other kind of configuration options are passed in. We also have the contents inside the floating element. So if we take a look at it again, it's been a moment, you can see that it actually has two parts. It's got the text content that's being rendered in the kind of lighter block, and then it's got the arrow that's positioned just below. So here's the element that's kind of the content within, and then here's our little arrow below. And you can see that arrow is actually a component that's provided from Floating UI Svelte. What it's doing in the background is it's actually rendering a little SVG, so a little scalable vector graphic that is then colored and positioned into the right place to kind of match whatever the position is. So if the tooltip is above or the tooltip is below, the arrow can kind of flip or adjust to the left and right to make sure the line's properly. So some cool stuff with that. Again, we're doing a reference to that, binding an element reference. We're also providing the context information so that the arrow knows the information about, okay, so floating position is being calculated. It's being kind of deciding where it needs to be rendered, pass that additional information onto the floating arrow component right there. That way it can update itself. Okay, so let's see. What else do we have on here? So there's a few other things that we've kind of configured up at the top. We're actually using a state rune, which is a brand new Svelte 5 feature. This is reactive state that updates on demand. So If that state changes, then it kind of reactively updates anywhere that's referenced. The other thing we've got is kind of our binding to our particular element here. So we're binding the arrow element reference. We're just using, again, a state rune for that by default. And then we have our configuration for within the floating element itself. So this is using, I'll kind of run through these options real quick just so you kind of have an idea of what they are. These are documented in the documentation site, so please do reference that as well. But basically it's saying when the pop-up is rendered, it might move, somebody might scroll the page or something like that. This is kind of running the calculations to make sure that that updates on demand. So if the pop-up needs to flip, it's too close to the edge or something like that, this just tells it, hey, make sure you update yourself when some of those scenarios occur. We're passing the reference to the open state. We're also getting and updating the open state based on when open is changed. So when you hover or when you click or something like that, that status should change. We're changing the placement, and we can actually change this real quick just to kind of demonstrate it here. So previously it would go above, and now it's going below. So we can do that. We can do it over to the right, so it comes off the right side of the page, just like that. We can actually see the whole pop-up now, which is really nice. So several options for that. If you're curious about like what specific options you can use here, just note that we do have TypeScript set up for this, so you should see recommendations provided for pretty much every option. So there is like a left end, left start, on and on and on, lots and lots of options. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and keep it as top. That seems most familiar for a tooltip, so we'll keep that and use that. Additionally, we're using middleware, which is actually an array. It takes a variety of options because, again, these are small modules that we add progressively to add certain features. And so you can see we have a few kind of added by default for this example. We're using the offset, which is the distance between the reference element, the button, and the pop-up over itself. So if we zero that out, if we take that to 0, we're going to see what that does. Now there's no room for that arrow. Everything's kind of squished together, right? So we want to keep that. Flip just says, hey, when it's getting too close to kind of the edge of the page, make sure it flips. So that'll be more useful when you're scrolling. We don't scroll on this demo yet, so we won't quite see that. And then we have all of the kind of reference information provided and passed in regarding the arrow itself. So the element reference, that we're using it, and so on and so forth. And using, again, that arrow middleware that's being provided from Floating UI Svelte. The last little bit here is towards the bottom. This is the user interactions. And so user interactions is kind of interesting because it consumes other hooks that are related to positioning or interaction, roles for like ARIA roles and things like that, and then any kind of like dismiss function. So like if you click outside or something like that, all of those features are kind of fed into the user interactions. And so you can see those defined above. We're setting what the role is going to be for the ARIA role. We're using the use hover hook, which has some both kind of a reference to the context and also its own kind of configuration options for any of these hooks. We're using the use dismiss just with default settings, nothing passed in. And then we're passing all of those in an array right here at the bottom. So that just means that use interactions will then say, okay, that's working with all of those. And you're gonna notice each of these is providing a reference. Interactions is actually kind of passed down, and that's where that kind of spread is used. So when I mentioned that we're spreading some properties or spreading some attributes onto the button and onto the floating element, this is where that's occurring. Okay, so very long-winded kind of talk through that demo, but again, let's look at our demo, and we've got a couple issues that I mentioned that we need to fix. One is that it's off screen, and two, that our arrow is not the right color. And so the first thing we're going to do is actually bring in a new additional middleware feature that's not currently implemented. So the one we need, we can go to the Floating UI site if you're curious to see what any of these middleware are, pieces are or how you use them. You can come right here to this middleware section, and it'll kind of give you a walkthrough of what middleware is, and then a walkthrough of what each of these actually represents. So if we're using flip or offset, you can come in here and see what are those actually doing. The one we're really interested in here is called shift, which just shifts the we'll use a little demo here, shifts the popover just to ensure that it stays within the view. It doesn't go off the side of the page or anything like that. And so we're going to actually grab Shift here. We're going to go back to our project, and we're going to import that right here. And then down here in our list of middleware, we're going to add it. I'm just going to do it as, I'm keeping it in the same order that's on the documentation site in case you're curious here. We're going to apply that, and then let's just try it with the default. It's not probably going to be perfect yet, but let's try it with the default settings. And so with that imported, that added to the middleware list, let's take a look, and there we go. Now our floating element is now kept onto the screen. It's kind of pushed over to the right since everything is so close to the left. Now you might be saying, okay, I don't really want it bumping up exactly against the edge of the page. So that's something that is in your control. And so like most of the middleware, you can provide a set of options here. You're going to see padding is an option that you can provide here. And then whatever amount you want. And this will be in pixels. I'm going to do 16 pixels. And so what that's going to do is it's going to shift the overall element with a padding of 16 around all the edges on the display. So if we save that and look, there we go. Now we have a little gap over on that far left side of the page, right over here, which is one of our issues fixed. So again, nice demo of where kind of middleware comes in and how that can be used. And again, the other issue we have here is related to the floating arrow itself. And so if we want, we can actually, let me see, this may cause a couple bugs. I'm going to just delete the element here. I'm going to delete the middleware, and I'm going to delete the reference here. Okay, save that. And you're going to see you can render this if you want to simplify things. You can render without the arrow. It is optional, but we need those three things in place. We need the reference that we're binding to, we need the middleware, and we need the component itself on the page. Okay. Now you're going to see there is already kind of a pre-filled color value here. So if we take that off, let's just take a look at what that looks like. So taking the floating arrow component, removing the fill property, let's see what it looks like. And so the arrow is still there. It may be really hard to see on the background color, but it's a really dark, jet black color right now. So that's not quite right. That's not quite what we want. So what if we change that? What if we said, let's make it green? We'll change it to a very kind of obvious color here. And there we go. Now we have a green colored arrow. Now what we really want is we want this to match one-to-one with what the color is in the popover itself. And so to do that, the easiest way to do it is just really to match the color itself. And so since I'm using Tailwind to do this, I'm applying the slate color here. I've just gone ahead and just run the calculation to just determine what the hex color value of this is. And so we're going to do this initially with a hex color. So I'm going to just provide this directly in here, save that, and come take a look. And now we have a nice flush, same colored arrow, which looks really nice. Now you might be asking yourself, hey, I do want to use Tailwind. I am a fan of Tailwind. I want to match that one-to-one. How can I do that? And so if you're curious, you can actually take the class here. You can take the fill, and then we're just going to change this to say class equals background slate 500. And I think it will actually be a fill color. So we're going to change that. And I could be wrong here. Let's try it. I'm doing this live. So let's save that. Let's take a look. And there we go. I nailed it first time. So that's now using a Tailwind color. If I was to change this to, let's go with red 500. You can see that is using an actual Tailwind class there. So both utility approach with Tailwind or your own custom values are allowed. And I believe you can also use CSS custom properties. I haven't personally tried it, but everything should work if you want to go that route. Okay, so there we go. We now have a floating element that is positioning itself the way it's supposed to. The arrow is displaying the way we want it to. It's got the content we want, and pretty much it's fully functional there. And you might be asking yourself, what would I do with this next? Like, how could I improve this? And so there's a couple concepts you might be thinking about here. You could abstract this perhaps to a component for some kind of a reuse so that you don't have to set up all of your hooks and everything over and over and over. You don't have to set your offset values. You don't have to change the color. over and over and over throughout every instance. So that is an idea that you could do, maybe something to consider. But that's not really the goal or the purpose of Floating UI Svelte. We're just providing the primitives that allow you to use Floating UI and make it a very simple and consumable API that you can use to do all this configuration, do all this setup. So yeah, that's really kind of the main things to take away. We now have a fully functional demo, and so the only thing I will kind of echo here is that please do come take a look at the docs, come take a look at the information that we're providing, the examples we're providing, the API information we're providing for each hook. There's a lot of really critical and really interesting information provided for all of these. You may also know that Floating UI Svelte is based on Floating UI React, and so we actually link to the kind of the equivalent documentation on the Floating UI site if you're kind of curious to see how Floating implemented this directly in their version. Come take a look at that. They do have a few things that are a little better explained in the docs, so that's some stuff we're going to be working on, like showing the actual placement values and things like that. So just know that's the kind of stuff we're still working on. We're kind of getting there. There will be additional components, there will be additional features, additional utilities provided that aren't yet here. Those are the kind of work in progress and where we're coming from. So if you're curious, definitely kind of keep an eye on the project. We are updating everything probably every couple weeks or so. Just keep an eye on our GitHub, which is linked up here at the top. We have a Discord channel for Floating UI Svelte as part of the Skeleton Labs Discord. And then if you would like to see, the version itself, you can come in here and see whatever the latest version that is released. Changelog will be included, and that'll detail everything that you need to know of what's been updated, what's been changed, and things like that. We'll probably also post the occasional, if not video, at least written post that kind of details things. You'll be able to come onto the repository and see like an announcement section here in the discussion section that's posts similar to this one where we're talking through and maybe showcasing some of the features. And then if you're, if you try things out and you have some feedback, please do reach out to us. We're available both on GitHub, as I just linked and showed, on Discord, that's linked here at the top. And of course, you can even reach out in the video comments if that's the best way for you. So let us know what you think. And hopefully, you like everything. We're real excited to get this in folks' hands. And again, enjoy. Thanks, everyone.